Have you ever wondered how to make the perfect sourdough loaf? Welcome to the enchanting world of sourdough bread making, a culinary art form steeped in history and loved by many. Sourdough bread, with its distinctive tangy flavor, beautifully crusty exterior, and soft, chewy interior, is the result of a simple yet magical process. It's a dance between three humble ingredients: flour, water, and salt. But the real magic lies in the natural fermentation process, where wild yeasts and bacteria in the air and in the flour come together to create a living, breathing sourdough starter. This natural leavening agent is what gives sourdough its unique character and flavor. Indeed, the allure of sourdough goes beyond its taste. It's about the joy of creating something from scratch, the anticipation of watching the dough rise, and the satisfaction of pulling a golden aromatic loaf out of your own oven. Today, you're going to discover the steps to create your own perfect sourdough loaf. The first step in sourdough bread making is creating your starter. A sourdough starter, also known as levain, is a fermented mixture of flour and water that contains wild yeast and lactobacilli. This is the heart and soul of your sourdough bread. It's what gives the bread its distinctive tangy flavor and helps it rise without the use of commercial yeast. Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty of how to make it from scratch. You'll need just two simple ingredients: flour and water. Begin by mixing equal parts of these two in a clean jar. That's your initial starter. Over the next few days, you'll be feeding it with more flour and water to keep the fermentation process going. Speaking of fermentation, it's a natural process where the wild yeast and bacteria in your starter break down the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. This not only gives your bread its rise and flavor, but also creates the distinctive sourdough aroma we all love. Maintaining your starter requires a bit of commitment. You'll need to feed it regularly, usually once a day, by adding more flour and water. If you notice a layer of liquid forming on top, don't panic. That's just hooch, an alcohol byproduct of the fermentation process. Stir it back in or pour it off, then feed your starter as usual. The key to a successful starter is patience and time. It may take anywhere from 5 to 10 days for your starter to become active. During this time, you'll notice it becoming bubbly and rising in the jar, a clear sign that the wild yeast are doing their job. Remember, the starter is a living thing. It needs care, attention, and a warm environment to thrive. So keep your jar in a warm spot and make sure to feed it daily. Once your starter is bubbly and active, you're ready for the next step. And that's how you create the perfect starter for your sourdough bread. Stay tuned as we delve into the mixing and Autolyse process in the next scene. With a ready starter, it's time to mix your dough. Now, the art of mixing involves combining your starter, flour, and water. You'll want to ensure these ingredients are well integrated, creating a uniform mixture. Once mixed, we move on to the Autolyse process. This is a fancy term for simply letting your dough rest. Autolyse might sound complicated, but it's a key step in crafting the perfect sourdough. By allowing your dough to rest, you're giving the flour time to fully absorb the water, which starts the gluten development process. This leads to a dough that's easier to shape and a final loaf with a better texture. Think of Autolyse as giving your dough a little spa treatment. It's a moment of relaxation before the hard work of kneading begins. And the best part? It requires no effort from you, just patience and a little time. After autolyzing, the dough is ready for the addition of salt. Now, we introduce salt and begin the folding process. We've reached a critical stage in our sourdough journey where we take our dough to the next level. Salt is more than just a flavor enhancer in this process. It helps tighten the gluten structure and slows down the fermentation, giving the yeast and bacteria in the dough a more controlled environment to work their magic. To incorporate the salt, sprinkle it evenly across the surface of your dough. Then, with wet hands to prevent sticking, gently mix the salt into the dough until it's well incorporated. It's important not to rush this process. You want to ensure that every bit of dough gets its fair share of salt. With the salt mixed in, we now move on to the folding process. Folding the dough helps to develop the gluten network, which gives our bread its structure. To fold the dough, simply take one edge, lift it, and fold it over to the opposite side. Rotate your dough 90 degrees and repeat the process. Do this for all 4 sides of your dough. This should be done every half an hour for the first 2 hours of the bulk fermentation. Now let's talk about bulk fermentation. This is the stage where our dough will rise and develop its flavor. It's a crucial stage as it's where the yeast and bacteria in our starter really get to work, creating those beautiful bubbles that will become the air pockets in our bread. This process can take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, depending on the temperature and the activity of your starter. How do we know when it's done? Your dough should have risen significantly and be full of air pockets. It should look lively and bouncy, and when you give it a gentle poke, the dough should slowly spring back. Once the dough has risen and is full of air pockets, it's ready to be shaped. So, let's move on to the next exciting phase of our sourdough journey. The next step is shaping your dough and letting it proof. Now that we've allowed our dough to ferment, it's time to give it shape and let it proof. Shaping the dough is an art. It's a delicate balance between being firm enough to give the dough structure, yet gentle enough not to deflate all the gas bubbles we've worked so hard to create during the fermentation process. First, lightly flour your work surface. Gently turn out the dough onto this surface, taking care not to tear it. Now, using your hands, fold the dough onto itself, rotating as you go to create a tight ball. This process of folding and rotating, also known as tension pulls, helps to create a tight skin on the surface of the dough. Now that we have our dough shaped, it's time for proofing. Proofing is essentially the final rise of the dough before baking. This is when the dough develops its final size and flavor. It's a crucial step in our sourdough journey, not to be rushed. A proofing basket, or banneton, is a baker's best friend during this step. It provides support to the dough as it rises, helping it maintain its shape. Before placing your dough in the basket, be sure to dust it generously with flour to prevent sticking. Temperature plays a key role in proofing. A cool environment is ideal as it allows the dough to develop slowly, bringing out the complex flavors that make sourdough so unique. A good rule of thumb is to proof your dough for about 2 to 3 hours at room temperature, or until it has nearly doubled in size. Remember, patience is key. Proofing cannot be rushed. It's this slow rise that gives sourdough its characteristic tang and beautiful open crumb structure. After proofing, your dough is almost ready for the oven. Enjoy the anticipation. The best part is yet to come. Now comes the exciting part, baking your sourdough loaf. The oven is the stage, and your dough is the star, ready to perform its final act. Begin by preheating your oven. This is a crucial step, as a properly heated oven ensures that your bread will rise and bake evenly. For sourdough, you'll want to aim for a temperature of around 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, every oven is unique, so it might take a few trials to find the sweet spot for your particular appliance. Now let's talk about your baking surface. A Dutch oven or baking stone is your best friend when it comes to baking bread. These tools retain heat well, which makes for a consistent baking environment. If you're using a Dutch oven, you'll want to preheat it in the oven as it warms. When your oven is ready, carefully transfer your proofed dough into the hot Dutch oven or onto the baking stone. Remember to score the top of your loaf before it goes in to allow it to expand during baking. Now comes the hardest part, waiting. Your loaf will need about 20 to 30 minutes to bake. You'll know it's ready when it's beautifully browned and sounds hollow when you tap the bottom. Once your bread is baked, it's time for it to take a well-deserved rest. This is the cooling process, and it's just as important as every other step we've discussed. You might be tempted to dive right in and slice your warm, freshly baked bread, but resist that urge. The bread is still cooking from the residual heat, and slicing into it too soon can result in a gummy texture. Let your loaf cool on a wire rack for at least an hour, though some bakers swear by waiting until the next day. During this time, the crust will become perfectly crispy, and the flavors inside will continue to develop. This patience will reward you with a loaf that's as delicious as it is beautiful, with a perfectly chewy interior and a crust that sings when you slice it. And there you have it, your perfect sourdough loaf. Happy baking!